John Schoenheit is a founding member of Spirit and Truth Fellowship International, which began in January 1989. He has invested over 50 years in Bible study. He holds degrees in theology and philosophy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and has studied archaeology in Israel with the Hebrew Union College and taken courses at the Reformed Theological Seminary. He taught Old Testament history and other courses at the Way College and has travelled and taught all over the United States and in many countries around the world. John has authored a number of books and in 2000 started translation work on the Revised English Version, translation of the Bible with an accompanying commentary. John ran a home church for many years and now currently has an online fellowship. He lives in southwest Florida with his wife Jenivee and enjoys kayaking and fishing. John is actually travelling to Australia in about 5 weeks' time to participate in the UCA, the Unitarian Christian Alliance activities that are occurring in Australia towards the end of March. Just a quick update on that. On March 20 to 22, there will be activities at the Canterbury Ecclesial Hall, the Christadelphian Hall in Canterbury. On Friday evening at 7 p.m, there will be a live debate between Dale Tuggy and Michael Bird. The title is The New Testament, Jesus is Not God. So that proves to be a very interesting activity, which I know a lot of people have already booked in for. All the details of all these activities are on the UCA website. Following day, also at the Canterbury Christadelphian Hall, is an afternoon activity where Sean Finnegan is speaking to the subject, Translating the Holy Spirit, a smoking gun of the Trinitarian bias. Dale Tuggy will be doing a review of the debate, and David Alexander, a local Christadelphian, will be doing a presentation as well. Activities then move to the Sydney area. So on the following Thursday evening, that's March the 26th, an evening activity at the Hurstville Entertainment Centre, the Civic Centre, entitled Rediscovering the One True God and His Son Jesus. On that evening, there will be two presentations, one by myself entitled The Exalted Son, Why the Biblical Jesus is Greater than the Trinitarian One. And Dale Tuggy will be speaking to the subject, Why Protestants Should Be Unitarian Christians. Then on the next day, which is Friday, which goes through to Sunday, March 27 to 29, is the Live-In Weekend, the UCA Live-In Weekend at Stanwell Tops, just south of Sydney. And there's a host of activities designed during the weekend. I think you can attend as a day visitor if you choose to, or you can stay on site. Some of the activities, Sean Finnegan speaking to the subject, The Spirit as Christ Within Us. Sam Mansfield is speaking to the subject, Wrought with Wisdom, How Solomon Understood Genesis 1 verse 26 and 3 verse 22 and 11 verse 7. Greg Dybel is speaking to the subject, Did Jesus Really Live by Faith? Jerry Wywell is also presenting. Dale Tuggy will also be presenting. I think his title is The Incarnation is Not a New Testament Doctrine. And there's going to be workshops as well. There'll be a workshop by Jeff Dybel, by Zach Mayo from New Zealand, and also John is doing a workshop on the REV. So lots of activities, all can be seen on the UCA website, so check that out for details. John joins Wilderness Conversations to discuss his labour of love, the translation of the Scriptures into English without the bias of a Trinitarian theology. The online version of the REV, the Revised English Version, can be found at revbible.com, and there's also an app. John joins us on Wilderness Conversations. John, thanks very much for joining Wilderness Conversations.
I'm really glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, Stephen.
John, just before we get a couple of things we want to talk about. We obviously want to talk about the REV, the Revised English Version, which you're working on. But before we get into that, we also want to talk about the UCA. Perhaps just share a little bit about your history, your background. How did you hear about the gospel?
How did I hear about the gospel? Well, I was an atheist. My father was an atheist, and neither one of my sets of grandparents went to church. I was raised as an atheist, and then that worked really well until I was in seventh grade, And when I was in seventh grade, my good friend Chris Pond got a Ouija board, and we started asking it things, and it was flying around. And I came to realize there was a spirit world and that my father was wrong. But all of my friends were Christians, and they all hated church. Now, granted, I was in seventh grade, and that was back in the early 60s, like 59, 61, when, you really had to dress up, coat, tie, white shirt, the whole thing, even as a kid, to go to church. So no wonder they hated it. But it never occurred to me when I found out about the spirit world to look into Christianity, because all my friends were Christians and they hated it. So it couldn't have been good, and instead, so I dabbled in witchcraft for a little while, and then left that. And my maternal grandfather was a Zen Buddhist. And so he had passed away, but he left me his Zen Buddhist books. And so I began practicing Zen and doing the koans and the meditations and reading the literature. And then I really began to realize that was kind of a dead end, because it is true that you kind of lose your sadness because you detach from life, but you also lose your happiness. And I wasn't happy about losing my happiness. So I entered college as a freshman as an agnostic. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's out there. I don't know how it all works. And a girl talked me into taking a class on the Bible. And the Bible made so much sense and resonated with my heart. And I became a Christian, and that was in 1971. And I'm still a very dedicated Christian. I've never lost track with that. So kind of that's my background and how I got into Christianity from a college Bible class.
Great.
And then, of course, the ministry I was with all used the King James Version. So like everybody else, I used the King James Version. I read the King James Version for 17 years. And then one of my coworkers had a son. By that time, we were old enough to have children. And he had a son who took a class on Shakespeare. And my friend Walter was really encouraged by it. He's like, yes, because the King James, of course, is very close to Shakespeare in English. So it's like, his son comes home and he goes, so do you understand the Bible better? And his son goes, no, but I understand why I don't understand it.
Right, yeah.
And so in 1985, I discovered the 1984 NIV, which still is one of my very favorite Bibles. And it was like, oh my gosh, the vista just opened up. And I realized the difference it could make to have a translation that was correct and that was written in an English that you spoke, rather than that Middle English of the King James Version. And so in the year we started doing classes for teenagers, and we would use the NIV 1984. And in the year 2000, I'm using the NIV, but by then we had realized that a number of the verses in the NIV were wrong. And John 1:1 is a classic. The Word was with God and the Word was God. And that John 1:1 does not have to be translated that way, should not be translated that way. So, I'm teaching teenagers. And on one hand, I'm saying, to these teenagers who are kind of lost in the world like teenagers typically get, and I'm saying, you have to read your Bible and believe it. It's God's word. Then we go into study session, and I'd say, well, here's this verse, but it's not correct. And so we'd study it and correct it. And here's this other verse, and it's not correct. And we'd correct it. And finally, some different people came to me and said, you're confusing the teenagers. It never occurred to me, but they said, you're confusing the teenagers because you tell them they can believe the Bible, but then in your study sessions, you're showing them how they can't believe the Bible. They have to kind of retranslate it. And they said, why don't you do your own translation? Well, that was in the year 2000.
That's not a small undertaking.
Yeah, it's not a small undertaking, but I began it. I started it, and the first thing I did was we knew that we didn't have the time to do an entire translation from scratch, from the Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. Although that's what we're doing now, 26 years later. But what we started with was we searched the out-of-print English versions and found the American Standard Version was the closest we could find to start with. And so that then began the development of the REV proper.
So just clarify that. So the American Standard Version you thought was the best starting point because of it wasn't so biased, or it was easy to read? What was the criteria?
Really, one was that it used Jehovah instead of Lord.
Yeah.
So that made changing it pretty easy. A search and replace. It was highly respected. It was translated by men from 9 different denominations. So it wasn't like a Roman Catholic Bible or say a Baptist Bible or whatever. It was very, very neutral from that perspective. Those nine denominations, they kind of hammered it out and come up with a good translation. And the thing that, and it still wasn't my first choice, but the problem was my first choices were later. Like I would have used the Revised Standard Version, but it was in copyright. So we had to find an out of copyright version. The ASV was 1901, so it was out of copyright and available. And it used some of the older English, but for the most part, inside a Word document, those things can be easy to replace. Like you replace the withs with wases,
Yeah.
and that kind of thing. So that was the work we began in the year 2000.
So let me go back just a step, and that is, can you speak Hebrew and Greek, and what qualifies you to be involved in something like this? And sort of what was your training?
What qualifies me really is the breadth of my background. I took Greek in college. I took Hebrew in seminary. I'm actually studying Hebrew now with the Institute for Biblical Study, Israeli Institute for Biblical Studies, but I'm not completely fluent in either Hebrew and Greek, and certainly at a translator's level. So I've always rounded up a research team to be around me. My real expertise is in biblical customs, biblical history, and archaeology. I studied archaeology with Hebrew Union College in Israel in '77. I have a massive library of customs books and have been a voracious reader of customs books. And it's amazing how often it's the custom behind what's going on that determines how you translate a verse. And that's one of the reasons some of the translations are and ideas are simply wrong about the Bible, that kind of thing. And so what I do is I bring a breadth of history and archaeology and customs, and then I round up, like right now, in 25 years, you can imagine we've had different translators that come and go. Right now, our Hebrew team leader, Bill Schlegel, taught Hebrew at a college in Israel for 32 years, lived in Israel for 34 years, is fluent in biblical Hebrew, modern Hebrew. He's just amazing. Jerry Werewell, our Greek team leader, has taught Greek at the Atlanta Bible College. He has a PhD and 2 master's degrees, and he's working on a second PhD, which hopefully he should finish in, say, 15, 16 months, something like that. So basically, ever since I've started, I've surrounded myself with quality people who are qualified to do this. And then, of course, our Bible's on the open market. So we get suggestions and comments from people all the time. More and more people are reading it because it is a superb translation. We really work to what we refer to as an academically defensible translation, meaning that if you're a scholar and you look at the translation, it might not be the choice of vocabulary that you would use, but you can't fault it and say, oh my gosh, they're just over the moon. This is a total bias, that kind of thing. And a classic example of that would be John 1:1 itself, because the REV version of John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. What God was, the Word was.
It was the first verse I looked up when I heard about the REV.
Yeah, and people don't know this, but the New English Bible, which was done by some of the best Greek scholars in Europe, that's exactly the way the New English Bible reads. So if somebody's going to come and call me up and complain about, my knowledge of Greek and John 1:1, I'm going to say, you're calling the wrong people. Call over to England and talk to the people who did the New English Bible, because they seem to think this is the best translation of John 1:1.
Yeah, and it might sound like a little thing, but even just removing the capital W I think is really important.
Yeah, that kind of thing is exactly right.
Talk to us just a little bit about, I guess, the philosophy behind translation. If no one's thought about it before, they would think, that couldn't be that hard. You just translate it and away we go. What's so difficult? But of course, you've got the idea of a sort of a word for word or a more formal translation or a literal translation, sometimes people say, versus a thought for thought or a dynamic translation. How do you cross that? Well, perhaps tell us a little bit about it, and then how do you make those decisions?
Yeah, word for word translation, you think you can actually do it, but you can't do it. And the reason you can't do it is because there's so many words that have it, like, for example, in both Hebrew and Greek, the word for envy and the word for jealous are the same word. You just have to sort it out by context. So when you say make a word for word translation, here you've got to make a choice. And that's not word for word. Word for word is like the Bible says dog and you translate it dog, But when you have a word that has multiple meanings, and a lot of times there's not even an exact equivalent. I'll give you a couple of those. For example, something ate Jonah. Now, in both Hebrew and Greek, they make a distinction of what lives in the water by its size. If it's little, it's one thing, and if it's big, it's another thing. We make a distinction of what's in the water by whether it breathes through gills like a fish, or whether it breathes air like a mammal, like a whale.
Right.
So was it a fish that ate Jonah, like some kind of modified whale shark or something, or a gigantic monster shark? Or was it a whale that ate Jonah, like a sperm whale? We don't know. And when you bring that into English as whale or fish, you've made a decision.
Right.
And you're telling your reading audience this is what it is, and that's why you've got to have commentary, and that's why there are versions, and I think it's the New American Standard Version that just says it's a sea monster. Well, to me, that's worse.
Yeah, that's got other connotations.
Yeah, exactly. That's got other connotations. And another one, it says in Thessalonians 4 that we're going to meet the Lord in the air. Well, the word meet in Greek is a very specific word, apantesis, and it means that you leave your place where you are, you go out and meet people in a common place, and you bring them back. Now, that was very important in the ancient world because they didn't have street signs. They didn't have house numbers. Like, I'm going to head to Australia and I've got a physical address and I'm going to get picked up at the airport. And between GPS and road maps, I could find it.
Right.
In the ancient world, it's like, well, it's somewhere in Athens. Try and find it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to say, well, we'll meet at the Agora in central Athens, and that's a small enough place that in half an hour or so we'd be sure to find each other, and then I'll bring you home.
Right. So it has the implication that it's not the end location that we're going to.
Right. We're coming back to my house.
Right. I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. So we go up into the clouds to meet Christ, and then we bring him back. So I'm teaching this in the Philippines about apantesis and how we don't have an English word to match this, and so you have to describe it in commentary. We just use the word meet, even though it's inadequate, but we use that word. And I'm teaching this in the Philippines, and the audience goes, "We have a word like that." And I got to thinking, this is the Philippines. A lot of the villages don't have street signs. They don't have house numbers. So they need a custom like an apantesis. Another reason that you can't really do a word for word is that sometimes words that we use in English we kind of assign a meaning to them that then doesn't represent the meaning of the text itself. And we run into that, for example, in Ruth chapter 3, when Ruth needs a kinsman redeemer, and there's Boaz, but there's a kinsman redeemer that's closer than Boaz. And so what Boaz says in the Hebrew text is, if the other kinsman redeemer wants to redeem you, tov, good, then let him do so. And you're like,
right.
In English, he's trying to dump Ruth off.
He's not so keen. Yeah.
Right, exactly. He's not so keen. So even though the literal meaning of tov is good, in that context, the word tov in Hebrew has a semantic range. And so we've got to say, well, how would you bring that out in English that it's like, that's the law, we have to do what it says? It's just, and so you've got to come up with that and come up with that translation. So there's the woodenly literal translation, which it's a myth. You really can't do it. You can come close in a lot of ways, but then it makes it very wooden, and very hard to understand. And then there's like the NIV that has a dynamic equivalent, which is they look at the Hebrew word, sentence, phrase, or sentence and say, okay, how would you bring this over into English? And the NIV does a very good job of that, actually, but it's still a little less literal than I'm comfortable with.
Right.
And so the ESV was done in what they call an essentially literal translation form, and that I think is what we like. You're literal whenever you can be, but when you can't, then you have to drift and figure out, okay, how's the best way to say this in English? And one of the things that we do in the REV that I really like, that's in the King James and the New American Standard Bible, for example, is italics. When we have to add a word for clarity of meaning, then we put it in italics. And that way the reader knows that, okay, they're clarifying the meaning here. It's not really in the text, but it's what you might call, it's within the semantic range of the Hebrew or Greek word, but it's not strictly there's not really a word for it in the text. It's just expanded or clarify it. And we use italics quite a bit because there are just so many places. For example, Hebrew doesn't even have a present tense to be verb. You and I use the word is. He is a good man. They don't even have is. The Greek has an is, estin, but they don't use it a lot, which is really funny, to you and I. That's really funny. It's like, how do you talk without is?
We use it so often.
Yeah. So, so you work the best you can to bring the meaning into English. And I like the essentially literal.
That explains why you end up with bias in the translation. So you could naively say, well, let's translate with no bias, like zero bias, like straight from the text. But because you're doing at least some interpretation, there is inherently bias then. And you seem to almost admit that in your introduction, dare I say it.
Oh, well, yeah, we do it. You can't translate without a bias. It's just like, if you're an ichthyologist and you study fish for a living, you may, like, I have a friend who studies fish for a living. She's paid to do that, but she studies ocean-going mammals, whales, porpoises, dolphins, that kind of stuff, and so she likes whales. So the idea to her that Jonah was eaten by a whale, that's very attractive. Where Jonah being eaten by a fish is not attractive. Then you have somebody else who studies and loves fish, and the idea that Jonah is eaten by a fish and not a whale is very attractive. And as an English translator, you got to make a choice, and that's a bias. And there's so many of those. I mean, Romans 9:5, talking about Jesus Christ and God, the way you punctuate that and the way you arrange the phrases. You either translate it in a way that makes Jesus Christ God, or you translate it in a way that doesn't make Jesus Christ God. And there's those are the two choices. Legitimate translation just doesn't exist because we had our punctuation. The original Greek had no punctuation. Not even spaces between the words. It doesn't play a part that much. But for example, let's take if you write this out without any spaces, God is nowhere. It's like, wow, God is nowhere. That's amazing. Oh, that exact same phrase is God is now here.
Yeah.
So it's impossible to bring the text out without some kind of bias.
Let's talk about some of the decisions you made. You made a choice to use the name Yahweh, move away from Jehovah and obviously Lord from the King James Version.
Yeah, well, and Jehovah's a made-up word, of course, taking the vowels of Adoni and the consonants of Yod-He, Vav-He, and putting them together and coming up with Jehovah. Actually, there's no J sound in Hebrew. The J doesn't exist in Hebrew. It's just like, we're used to, especially in America and probably in Australia too, we have a lot of Asians over here. And you probably have Asians in Australia. And Asians can't say, like, there's certain letters they can't say. Like the P, they have a really hard time with. But then, when I look at Hebrew and I'm trying to learn and speak Hebrew, there's this glottal stop that any native Hebrew person can instantly know, oh, he's an American trying to speak Hebrew.
That's right.
Because you just have this American accent. And so, so Yahweh is, from what we understand by looking at other different words, like, for example, there's not only Yahweh, but, for example, Yeshua starts with a Y type of thing. For we call it Joshua. And again, there's no J in Hebrew. So Jerusalem in Hebrew is Yerushalayim, and it's a Y sound. So Yahweh, the other reason I really like Yahweh and not Lord is because, and by the way, the REV, and you'll notice this, if you go to any chapter, you got to go to a chapter, not a verse. But if you go to any chapter in the REV, at the very top, you'll see a little speaker icon. And you punch that speaker and it'll read the chapter to you. And, if you're listening to the Bible being read between Adonai and Adoni and the King James Lord and stuff, you're sitting there, you don't know what the text is saying if it's being read to you. But if you use Yahweh, then it's like, okay, when it's Lord, it's usually Adonai. And when it's Yahweh, it's Yahweh. And you can understand the text much better. So that, I think, is an important change, is using Yahweh.
Tell us a little bit about, you've already mentioned sort of where you've come from and where you're going with the REV. What's sort of the goal for the next, what's the goal for this year and then beyond?
Well, we translate kind of a combination of through the Bible and then holistically, because for example, with Yahweh, with over 6,000 uses, when we translated, got it into the REV, then it goes through the whole Bible. And then there are a number of words that come up through the whole Bible. And so in one sense, you can't do a translation of just one verse, because when you make that translation call about how you're going to do that, then that will flow through the whole Bible. And I'll give you a great example of that. It was a couple of years ago, the base text read high places, like the people were always worshiping in the Old Testament at high places. Well, the problem with that is, and I told you I studied archaeology in Israel with Hebrew Union College, the high places aren't high. A lot of times the high places are in a low place, and they're called high places. And the Hebrew word, or behemoth, it's just a little raised platform. It's like, for example, it's like a little bitty stage wherever it is. It might be a foot off the ground. It might be 18 inches off the ground, something like that. It could be built up a little higher for sure, but it can be a low place. And I read the Bible for years about the high places, and I thought it was always on tops of mountains. And it's not at all. It's in the middle of town. And like I say, it can be a low place. So in the REV, we made the decision to translate it shrine, because that's actually what it is. The people who lived there would take the geography that they had, and if it was low place, it was low place. They'd build up a little mound, and then they'd put their idols up there and their little temple up there and that kind of thing. And it became a shrine where they worshiped. So we made the decision to translate Behemoth as shrine. Well, you can't just do that in one book.
Right. Yeah.
So, so when you make that translating decision, then you translate it through the whole Bible. The same with Yahweh, it translates through the whole Bible. And so in one sense, when we started with the historical books, because typically the Hebrew is easier. With the New Testament, we kind of cheated. We started with the New Testament. We started with the tiny books like Jude and Philemon, because you want to feel like you're accomplishing something.
Yeah.
So we hit those first. But in the Old Testament, we started with the historical books: Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. because the Hebrew is easier. So we got those books completely translated, verse by verse, word by word. Then we started in Genesis, and we're working through right now. We're in Numbers chapter 28, and we're working through. In fact, as soon as I get off the Zoom call, I've got a translating session. We have about 4 translating sessions a week, and then I write commentary at other times. So it's a kind of some of the words go through the entire Bible and affect the entire Bible. Some of the words we just wait till we get to that verse. So our projection is to get the entire Bible, Old and New Testament, done to where we're happy with it, and then continue to write commentary. Because right now, I've done most of the commentary writing. I've written commentary now over 15,000 verses. There's 32,000 verses and change in the entire Bible. So I'm just a shade under halfway through the entire Bible. But a whole bunch of the verses in the Bible, honestly, are like, and the Lord said to Moses. So you don't need any commentary for that. So I've actually got commentary on a lot more verses, the verses that really matter, than most people would think.
And just clarifying commentary, it's not sort of a systematic commentary or sort of a commentary like we might use commentaries for the Bible, but it's commentary specifically to explain the translation or the decision behind the translation.
A little of both.
Okay.
If the translation involves a decision, actually, then yeah, we want to explain why we made that judgment call. But other than that, we want to help people understand the verse.
Okay.
I'll give you a great example of that, of where we do both. So we take Romans 8:28. Now, Romans 8:28 in your average Orthodox Bible reads, all things work together for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose.
Right.
Well, the problem is all things don't work together for good. If your car killed in a car wreck, you're dead. So what people don't know is that with a shift in the way the Greek is handled, it becomes in all things God works for the good of those who love him. And that is true. God's always working for the good. So then in the commentary, we explain the shift. How did we make the shift? By the way, I told you I like the NIV 1984. That came to my attention from my reading of the NIV 1984. I remember the first time I read that years ago. 1985 was when I was introduced to that Bible. And I read that and my eyes got wide. I was like, holy smokes, can it actually be translated that way? And then you do the lexical work and you find out, yeah, that's a very legitimate translation.
Right.
But if you're coming from a Calvinist background, which most of the King James translators and all those guys were, then you translate it in a Calvinistic way that God, is controlling everything and somehow he's going to turn it all into good. So there's that kind of thing. So where we explain how do you make the shift from the Orthodox translation to the NIV 1984 translation, which we basically have that exact same translation. And then the second part of the commentary then is, what does that mean to you? How do you incorporate that into your life when something bad happens? So in a sense, the commentary in the REV is a combination of what we would call an academic commentary, like the International Critical Commentary, and a study Bible, the notes you would expect in a study Bible.
Okay.
Now, we do have a long-term project. Jerry Werwell is he's very aggressive about this. He's figuring that this is going to be a 25-year project, and he's rounding up people, and he wants to do a full academic commentary from a biblical Unitarian perspective. And that's going to take a quarter century. I mean, if I'm alive when it's finished, it'll be a miracle of God. But it would be a fabulous thing to have. But for most people, an academic commentary is just way over the heads of what they want when they read the Bible. They want to know, what does this mean and what does it mean to me? Yeah. And can they actually translate it this way?
So if I'm looking at the REV and I look up a verse, a chapter, a book, is there any way of me knowing whether this is a book that you've spent quite a lot of time on and you've gone back and reworked the whole thing, as opposed to it's the American Standard Bible, which with some updates like Yahweh or whatever?
Yeah, basically, any of the prophetic books, like the last ones, there's a couple like the book of Malachi, which we've spent a fair amount of time on. But other than that, yeah, what you're looking at is the the American Standard Version of 1901, with the exception, like I say, that there ends up being improvements, in a whole bunch of verses to straighten things out. So
Yeah.
if you read in most of the entire Bible, if you read the 1901 beside the REV, you'd see, like in the prophetic books, you'd see some similarity, but you would also see a lot of difference, because of the updated English and because of the words that we have gone through and modified and changed, just due to our general work.
So just tell us a little bit about how we can get to the REV, just so people listening can check it out.
Oh, yeah. And the REV is very easy to get to. Didn't used to be. Again, I credit this to Jerry Werewell. Jerry is really aggressive when it comes to this computer stuff. So you just go to revbible.com. That's as simple as it is. And then there's some tutorial videos, but really the REV is a very powerful program, and it's worth getting to know it. For example, in the REV, we have a menu at the top, and that gives you all the books of the Bible, and you could click on a book and then a chapter and that kind of thing. We also have appendices. Like we have an appendix, is the dead are dead. We have an appendix that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, not God the Son. We have an appendix, what is the Holy Spirit? When a commentary grew to more than 6 pages, then that's an awful lot to read. Then we made it an appendix to give people a choice. So we have a number of appendices. We have a search function. And the search function works for the King James Version or the REV. So if you can remember a word in the verse and you're like, oh, where's that verse that says, if you can remember a word in the verse, you can search for it. We have a topics function. You can click on the topics, and we have over 350 topics that come up. Like you might say, what do these guys say about salvation? You just go to the menu at the upper left-hand corner, click that little 3-bar menu. I call it a hamburger menu because it looks like a hamburger with a bun and the meat in the middle. But anyway, you click on that, and up comes, you can search, you can do topics. There's a number of choices. You can also, with the font, it comes with Merriweather font, but if you don't like Merriweather, you've got a choice of 6 fonts. You can change the font size if you want. You can change the spaces. Like if you're reading, is like my 74-year-old eyes, you can make the space between the lines a little bigger or a little smaller. If you're a teenager or some of the young 20s, they like the white letters on a black background. To me, that's just like, I can't even imagine reading that. It's like, But hey, if you're a teenager and that pushes your buttons, you just change the background to black and the letters become white. Or if you don't like the kind of blue-white of a screen, you can click on sepia, and the background becomes a little more yellowy brown, so a little easier on the eyes, particularly at night. So you can change the font, you can change the font size, you can change the font spacing, you can change the color of the screen. It also has, and I won't go into this because it takes a little bit of explaining, but it's got a section called My REV, and you sign up. Basically, you go to the thing that says My REV in there, and you click on it. And then what that does is it allows you to make your own notes. So if you're doing teachings and that kind of thing, and you want your notes on your Bible, just like you'd write on a hard copy Bible and write your note in the margin, you can write to your heart's content on any verses. Another thing we have is a download feature. So if, let's say, you want to study a particular book, let's say you want to study the book of Esther, and you're going to mark it up and do all kinds of things for teaching, you just go to the first chapter of the book of the Bible, and you just click the download symbol, and it can either download as a Word document, which then you can manipulate, or it can download as a PDF, and you can download anything from the entire Bible, which I wouldn't recommend because it'd probably be over like 15,000 pages or something in Microsoft Word, 1,500, I'm sorry, 1,500 pages, because the New Testament turns out to be, I think, 408 pages if you print the entire New Testament in Microsoft Word. And the Old Testament's considerably larger. But you can. I mean, if somebody said, I want this in a hard copy, and I do that occasionally if I'm teaching a book and I want to study, I'll just download the book. Also, if you use another Bible program, our computer guy, Rob Woods, has worked it to where eSword, MySword, Accordance, BibleWorks, Logos, Sword Searcher, all these other programs will accept the REV. So, for example, I use Accordance. That's my primary Bible study program, software program. And about every 2 or 3 months, I morph the REV, because we're changing it every day, and I add commentary, and I morph that into Accordance.
Right.
So the REV is in my Accordance program.
Okay.
So there's all kinds of cool things you can do like that that are super helpful.
I hadn't noticed the read function, which you mentioned, so it'll actually read it for you.
Yeah, you just, in fact, actually, let me do that right now. So I'll just go to, what do we like? You like Romans? Let's go to Romans chapter 1. Here's our little speaker. And now when the speaker
Romans
comes
chapter
up,
1.
let me pause this a second. We got a choice here. We can have a United States male. We have a United States female. We have a UK, United Kingdom, a deep male voice. And we have a UK female voice. Like, here's the deep male voiced UK.
Chapter 1. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle.
Okay, so you get the idea.
It's very easy to listen to.
Yeah, and then if you want the reading function, it has a little rabbit and a little turtle.
Oh, wow.
So if you find it, if it's going by too fast, you click the turtle, and every time you click the turtle, it slows down a little more. Same thing the other way. If you want to do a quick reading, you click the little rabbit, and then normally it just reads one chapter and then stops, but then there's a little symbol with arrows going around in a circle, and if you click that, wherever you start, it'll read to the end of the book of Revelation.
And also there's an app. I downloaded the app, which looks like it's a bit of it's mimicking the web page by the looks of it.
It does. It mimics the web page. It doesn't have the full function of going to the web page itself.
Right.
For people that like apps, it's very handy. It's nice to have an app. For me, it's just as easy because I bookmark the REV Bible. So it's just as easy for me to open the computer and click on it.
Yeah.
If you're the kind of person like me who reads the Bible a lot, then you just spend $150 and get a tablet, or spend $300 and get an iPad or whatever. And it just makes it so nice to hold something that's the size of a regular book and read it. That's super helpful.
And you mentioned that you're happy to receive feedback on translation as well.
We do. Yeah, we do with great regularity. So, and that's one of the reasons, that the Bible keeps improving and improving and improving. The other thing we get, it's kind of funny, we get feedback on the Bible, but for example, I got a comment from, there's Bible study groups all over the world now. So I got a note from a women's Bible study group, and they said, we're studying, and it was one of the books in the Old Testament. And they said, we're studying this book, and we can tell that within the next few weeks, we're going to come up on this verse that none of us understand. And we don't agree with each other, but we love your commentary. Can you write commentary on that verse for us so we know what it's saying? So that's one of the things I do too. I have a list of verses in the queue that I'm waiting to write commentary on.
Well, one of the questions I had for you, and it comes up in the philosophy of translation and also in the discussion around bias and translation bias and so on, and that is your position on Unitarianism as opposed to a belief in the Trinity. What's the background there for you?
Well, for me, like I say, I was raised atheist, and then I dabbled in witchcraft, and then I dabbled in Zen Buddhism, and then I became an agnostic, and then finally I became a Christian. And thankfully, the ministry that discipled me first and got me born again was a non-Trinitarian ministry. And so I've never been a Trinitarian, but I've certainly run into, dozens and dozens of people that started out as Trinitarians and then have seen the biblical Unitarian position. And so the REV is decidedly, we talked about translating with a bias, like, for example, John 1:18, about, well, let's just go there and read it, because you can't really translate it without having a bias, because you've got to make a decision there on the Greek text that no one has ever seen God, the only begotten Son, who's in a most intimate relationship with the Father. He has explained him. So when it comes to the only begotten Son, you can say the only begotten Son. That's a way of translating the Greek. That's traditional, King James Version and many of the older versions. You can say the only begotten God, if you think the Greek text should be theos rather than huios, and a number of versions do that. Or you can say the unique God or the unique Son. So there's at least 4 different ways to translate that phrase from the Greek. And again, as soon as you make a choice, there's your bias. We're non-Trinitarian and see no reason why the only begotten Son doesn't make perfect sense here. It certainly makes perfect sense in John 3:16, that kind of thing. So that's an example of a bias. I mentioned Romans 9:5. Let's go to Romans chapter 9, verse 5. You would be amazed. I read a commentary once that said there's more literature written on Romans 9:5 than on any other verse in the New Testament. I didn't read all that literature to see if that's true, but the way we've punctuated it, to them belong the fathers, talking about Israel, and from them, according to the flesh, is the Christ, period, parenthesis, God, who is over all, be blessed forever, period, amen. That is a decidedly non-Trinitarian translation. You can translate the same Greek in a Trinitarian way. It's the Christ, comma, God, comma, who is over all.
Right. Yep.
Just a choice of punctuation. So the point is that the person who's putting the pen to paper has to make a choice. Are you going to translate this in a way that says Jesus is not God, or are you going to translate this in a way that says Jesus is God? You have to make a choice, because it's going to come out one way or the other. And that's where you are correct in saying you cannot translate the Bible without bias. It simply can't be done. And so we believe the weight of evidence strongly supports that Jesus Christ is not God. And that comes from just the plain statements that he makes. The Trinitarians, as you know, there's no verse in the Bible that actually defines the Trinity. The Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. Together, the 3 of them make one God, and the Son is 100% God and 100% human. That statement is simply nowhere in the Bible. What is in the Bible is statements like Jesus saying, "My Father is greater than I," or he's praying to God and he says in John 17, "You are the only true God." Or in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the head of the wife is the husband, the head of the husband is Christ, the head of the Christ is God, not the Father in 1 Corinthians 11, but God, theos. So these clear statements to me are so clearly non-Trinitarian that they then create the background, if you will, to verses like John 1:1 or Romans 9:5, where we have to make a decision. We're going to make that decision based on what? Well, to me, we're making the statements based on the clear statements that Christ and the apostles made. Like in Acts chapter 2, Peter talks about Christ, that he was a man approved of God. Now, that's a weird thing to say if Christ is God.
Yeah.
So anyway, you get the idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's timely because you're about to make your first trip out to Australia in 4 or 5 weeks' time for a Unitarian Christian Alliance function, which will be held in Melbourne and in Sydney.
Yeah, and I'm doing a workshop on the REV.
You're doing a workshop?
Yeah, I'm doing a workshop on the REV, introducing it to people that want to get to know how to use it and that kind of thing. And they can put it on their phone or tablet while they're there, and then I'll walk people through and kind of talk about what I did here, answer a bunch of questions, and show people how do you use this program to get the most out of it. And I'm really excited about that, because there are tricks like you saw with the speaker that's important to know. Also in the upper right-hand corner, there's a little clock going backwards. And that's extremely helpful if you're using the REV, like in a church service where a minister's got an anchor verse and then he goes out here and then comes back and then goes out over here and comes back and goes to this other verse and comes back. And rather than having to keep typing and punching what verse you're going to, you just hit the clock. It brings up all the verses where you've just been and you just click it.
Oh, yeah. It's like a history, list of history. Yeah, okay.
That's exactly what it is. And
Yeah.
it just makes using the Bible in real time with ministers who are actually teaching, it makes that very easy.
It's powerful. At first, it looks reasonably simple, but there's a lot of hidden stuff in there. It looks really good.
There's a whole bunch of stuff. Absolutely. It's just like the search function. You can search on a word, an exact word, a phrase, New Testament, Old Testament, church epistles. It really breaks it down to where, you're just not out there in the woods wandering around searching for something.
Well, John, it's certainly a labour of love, and thank you very much for joining Wilderness Conversations and sharing your journey and what you're up to, and God bless the work as you continue.
Well, thanks, and I look forward to seeing you in Australia. It'll be wonderful.
Thanks, John.
You're very welcome. God bless you, sir.